So perfect. Great. And so Salima is going to be running our speaker series today. So I'm only going to introduce her because she will be setting the stage um, and speaking with our other speaker who's joining us today. And we've also really laid a lot of space for audience questions and participation. So write down your questions as we go. Get ready, and we'll pass around the mic for those in the room, and those on Zoom can unmute later when Salima tells you it's time for questions. So without further ado, thank you so much, Salima, for putting this together, and over to you.
Thank you, Erin, for the introduction. Happy to be here. And thank you to Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson for agreeing to do this with us. Before I introduce Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we stand on at Tufts University and Friedman School. So Tufts University is situated in the traditional homelands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, those who have stewarded it for generations, and the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. So as an introduction for Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson, you may look her up, but I'll give a short introduction. Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson is a professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at the University of Maryland College Park. She is an affiliate faculty member of the Theater, Dance, and Performing Studies, the Department of Anthropology, African American Studies, the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity. She's a material culturalist who examines the lives of African Americans living in the United States from the late 19th century to the present, and her research explores the ways in which Black people, broadly defined, engage their material worlds, especially with food and food cultures, as well as historical legacies of race and gender misrepresentation. So the format is going to be very flexible. We're going to start off with a couple of questions for Dr. Williams-Forson, and then we'll actually have an opportunity for the audience to engage, upon which I'll share my screen and ask the audience to take about a minute to respond to an image that they see on the screen, and we'll flip-flop between one response on Zoom and then one response in person for the in-person audience. And then we'll get back to questions. And so we'll sort of go back and forth just to make sure folks feel that they're sort of engaged. And I hope it's an enjoyable session. So welcome, Dr. Williams-Forson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And just a slight correction, I'm actually professor and chair of American Studies. I'm an affiliate of African American Studies, but I'm actually chair of the Department of American Studies. And so few people have heard of it, so it often gets confused with African American, but they're not the same. But thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Yeah, so thank you for the clarification. One of my first question is about the title of this seminar. So we've entitled it Black Food Culture in the Age of Considerable, quote unquote, or parentheses, misinformation. And in our conversation to decide this title, you came up with the title. And so can you speak to us about this considerable information as well as misinformation in this day and age?
Sure.
About culture, Black food culture?
Sure. Again, thank you all for having me, and thank you all for coming to hear us. Afternoon, I'm looking forward to you all's questions. And you know, it's a stressful, hectic time of the semester. I have to acknowledge that I was jumping off of a call with a graduate student. I was like, oh my God, I'm supposed to be somewhere else. So thank you, Selena, for that. So we're in the age of obviously overwhelming information, right? We're in an age, obviously, also of overwhelming misinformation as we are in a very intense political moment. But where food is concerned, and specifically Black food conversations, that misinformation is pervasive. We are still in the 21st century believing that Black food diets historically derived from scraps. With the amount of data that has come out in the last 2 to 3 decades, it's a little surprising that we're still having or believing that narrative. I tend to liken this to what Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie refers to as a single story. Single stories are very convenient because they help us to solidify information, dispense it, repeat it very quickly without having to unpack it, be critical in our thinking about it. As far as African American foods are concerned, the other thing we hear so much of, oh, Black folks don't want to eat healthy, they don't exercise, literally all of these beliefs that tend to be pervasive, and they because they are so because they're so pervasive in dominant discourses. And when I say dominant, I mean mainstream media and our classrooms and so forth. It makes the work that you all do, it makes the work that I do ever more difficult, because the first thing we have to do is an unlearning and an unpacking. And then we can start the work of helping people to heal and think more holistically about their lives. So I'll stop there, and then, we can talk more about what the misinformation is as we go along.
Yes, wonderful. And so my next question is about, your bio says you're a material culturalist. Can you speak more about what that encompasses and the space in which food and Black food culture sits?
Yeah, so when I started graduate school many decades ago, I was it was at a moment of the evolution of the sort of explosion, if you will, of Black feminist thought. And so my entry into food studies actually began through literature, and um, I was in American Studies at the University of Maryland, actually, and I was studying 19th century Black women's lit. And there was a particular novel that I was very taken by. And one of the things that struck me was the amount of detail that this 19th century writer included in this novel, which had been resurrected by Oxford University Press and the Schomburg Library for Black study of Black culture and life. The amount of detail that she had put in the book about the interiors of Black life, food, decor, political leanings, women's roles in those political activities. And so, like any graduate student, you pull a thread. So I started pulling that thread, right? And found that when I moved on to the PhD program, I was really, really interested in food studies, because I also had a Jewish advisor who had me researching Jewish foodways. Specifically, she was working on an article around peddlers. She went on to write Hungering for America. This is Hasia Diner. She went on to write Hungering for America, the study of food among Jewish, Irish, and Italian immigrants. And I began to wonder, I had never heard of foodways. And so I was curious about whether or not this was something that Black people talked about. This is pre-Google, so I interneted Black people in food or foodways. And all of these images started popping up of Black people in very compromising positions with different foods, specifically chicken. Also, I was finding that the only thing that was emerging was cookbooks. So that told me what Black people ate, but not why. And it didn't go deeper to tell me some of the other nuances. And so that's what started me on my journey. But my first interest is in the ways in which we negotiate and engage our material worlds, of which, of course, food is a major component. Um, and so over the last 2 decades, as I've been doing this work, um, there's just been an outpouring, your work included, Salima, an outpouring of study on Black food culture. In a number of disciplines. Some of it is accurate, some of it is not. Some of it is based on, um, here, secondary sources that tend to be that tell a story but don't tell the whole story, right? And so that is really where my work comes from. I look at the provenance, I look at the origins, I look at the beginnings, to the extent that that's possible. And then I move forward. And so it has been painstaking work, carving out a field. Often because you're out on a limb saying things that people don't believe. I got a lot of pushback with my first book, which was my doctoral thesis. And I was debunked quite a bit until I did the work. I had to go deep into the archive to really get in there to say, actually, based on this wealth of information that does exist at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, this is what I'm coming up with. So, so that's what it means to be, for me, a material culturalist. I'm actually not a historian. I was not trained in history. I was trained in the study of the material world.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think when I first encountered that term, material culturalist, I was sort of taken aback and I didn't know exactly what that meant. So I don't know if anybody else in the audience feels that way. So thank you for sharing that. Now I'm going to transition and share my screen, and we're going to look at an image. These are all quilts in the sort of African American Black tradition. And so I would ask the audience to just take 1 minute and think about what you see, sort of what are your senses taking in with this image? And then if one person on Zoom would share what they see. Okay, so thank you for looking at the image, and I have some responses. One from Cassie Van Etten that I would actually like to unmute. Only Cassie, please, and tell me about your observation. And there are other responses, which thank you so much for engaging. But Cassie, would you, if you're able and comfortable, would you actually share why you put biblical imagery?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Okay. Um, So I was struck by the quilt square in the bottom right that I believe depicts the crucifixion. Um, and then also the towards the upper left corner, the second one, in the top row, um, I believe that's the nativity of Jesus. But also just a lot of, oh, and probably the Garden of Eden creation too. Just a lot of images about um, humans connecting with nature.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And you're correct in large part. So this quilt is called the pictorial quilt, and it was created by a woman born into enslavement. Her name is Harriet Powers. She's known as the mother of African American story quilt, the tradition. And that is an image of her. And if you see on her apron, she's actually fashioned, like appliqued some similar imagery seen in the quilt on her apron. And then I just wanted to highlight the center piece, which is actually, it's showing that Harriet was actually a form of historian. So this is an event that happened November 13th, 1833. It's called the Falling Stars. The people were frightened and thought that the end would come. God's hand stained the stars. The Warraments rushed out of their beds. And this actually occurred before she was born. So in the late 19th century, when Harriet Powers was born and living, these stories had been passed down, and then she actually documented them in this quilt. So I just wanted to sort of contrast this conversation about food and food ways and the legacy and lineage of that with also this parallel legacy of quilting and sort of documenting living in the US as a African American or Black American. So thank you so much for indulging us. We're going to get back to our questions with Dr. Williams-Forson. So my next question is about Black food culture and what you might say encapsulates sort of this idea and how it fits into the larger narrative of food culture. And feel free to speak more about what you mentioned earlier about the accuracy or the secondary sources that people might use. And I know when conceptualizing this session, we also talked about the familiarity with which people sort of come to this topic in terms of being able to speak about it that may or may not be accurate, that doesn't necessarily happen with other cultures or other groups of people. And if you would share your reasons for that and perhaps how you push back on it or sort of address it in your work.
Sure. I want to first say to tie the quilting piece into this discussion even more. Quilts become a very interesting part of Black expressive culture. They're part of many people's culture, right? I'm working with a student who's looking at Guatemalan embroideries, and so these textiles become very important for the historical resonance that they offer, right? And messaging. The quilts at G's Bin, for example, tell an incredible story of real food insecurity. Because, for example, when the owner, these enslaved people, formerly enslaved people who were working as sharecroppers, right? And this will get to tie into your question, who were sharecropping post enslavement. When the landowner passed away, the creditors who he owed emerged on G's bin and decided to call in the marker, if you will, for all of the equipment, farming equipment, and everything, right? So overnight, the residents of G's bin found themselves without implements to work the land. They found themselves without parts of their homes. They found themselves in a deep state of despair. And so in many of those quilts that were created by the G's Benders, you see the stories of that happening embedded therein. And one of the major stories that emerges is the way in which they survive by pulling together their foods in order to survive. I start with that because not only to tie in the discussion of quilts, but also to suggest that that's a story we don't often hear much about, right? The story of resilience. We're very quick to talk about food insecurity, and Black folks live in food insecure areas. They're in food swamps. You know, we understand food apartheid as a systematized way of disempowering people through the removal or not even the implanting of food spaces, right? But what we don't often talk about, and that's why I really like Ashanti Reese's work, is she looks at one community in Washington, D.C., who resisted that notion of the food desert and instead said, this is how we acquire food. Okay, this is not to say that we Black folks should not have access to grocery stores. You should. But as my colleague uh, uh, it states, and I'm blanking on her name. That's why I have two people's names in my mind, and I know one of them is not it. But LaDonna Redmond, who is a food activist, right? One of the things she says is grocery stores are not panaceas. Okay, they're not. They're not the end all to be all, because you can have a grocery store and the food is wilted, the fresh food is wilted. But these are not the stories that we talk about. How do you survive when you're not near a major food hub? Well, you figure out other ways of doing it. And that's what I talk about in the final chapter of my book, Eating While Black, where I talk about eating in the meantime, right? While we're waiting to overhaul the agro-industrial system so that everyone gets fresh food and vegetables, how do we allow people to survive in ways that will work for their family? One of the ways that they can do that, which lots of folks push back on, is being open to and encouraging people to actually buy food from Dollar Tree, Dollar Mart, or what have you. I came to this conclusion in a couple of different ways that I'll share very quickly. When my daughter was very young, she's now 20. So when she was about 2, I noticed that Dollar Tree specifically was getting refrigeration. And not only were they getting refrigeration, but they started selling bread and other food items. And I started thinking, who's buying this stuff from the Dollar Tree? Back then, before pre-COVID, you could get everything was $1, right? Well, over time, as I went to the dollar store, I noticed that it was lots of different people. You had the aged, you had those who maybe had visible disabilities. You had me, for example, because it's a one-stop shop. I'm in there buying all this crap for my child's next birthday party, amid balloons and bags, etc. Hey, I also need some wheat bread. Oh, I also need some garlic powder, and so forth and so on. Well, I had people tell me, well, that food is outdated, it's unhealthy, it's this. Possibly, but not so. Because just up the street, we had a Giant, which is the equivalent to, I guess, Bread and Circus or what have you. And because I lived in Connecticut, so, you know, that's what we had, one of those kinds of markets. they were selling the same products for $1. So I started asking myself, okay, so what's going on? If it's fresh over here, why is it not fresh over there? What is happening systematically that we're not promoting Dollar Tree as a viable alternative for people who are living on fixed incomes? I was giving a talk up at Mount Holyoke, and a colleague who's a social worker was explaining that oftentimes her aged clients could not take their medication because they were food insecure or without food come mid-month. I'm like, why are we not suggesting that they get beans and rice or ramen or what have you, and sharing with them how they can healthily cook those foods so that they're not without food come mid-month? Because at that time, if you had $19, $20, you could buy 19 items, right? And as we know, many people, whether when you're taking medication, you have to eat. So how do you enable college students? How do you enable everyday people and so forth and so on to buy food in various ways, bodegas, corner markets, what have you, in order to be able to live lives the way they need to live their life? Why are we hearkening to these prescriptions that say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this? Always. Why are we always starting with a deficit as opposed to empowering people so that they can live and continue to be in health in ways that best benefit them? Did I answer your question? I can't remember what it was. Sorry.
It was relatively long-winded, but no, I think you get at it. And to follow up and sort of respond, I want to ask about your book, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, because I think this conversation about prescription of what people should be doing, and not sort of being deviant or being seen as deviant is addressed again in this book. And so I want to specifically ask about this word shame and how it all ties in to eating Black America, and why you just felt it was important to include that word in the title.
Yeah, thank you. This is a sort of Game of Thronesian moment where, Cersei is like, shame, 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 walking down the street. That's what I began to feel. I wrote Eating While Black as a response to my experiences while touring, to share thoughts about building houses out of chicken legs. It was a moment, again, where building houses came out in 2006. So around 2007, 6 or 7 is when all of this stuff started happening in the Dollar Tree. It's also the time when we started hearing a lot about people growing their own food. And I would go places and literally give a full 45 to 1 hour, 45-minute conversation. And folks would come up to me and say, you left out something. And I'm like, oh, okay. And they said, yeah, you didn't talk about people, growing gardens. And I'm like, who are these people? And often it would be coded. The conversation was coded, or the comments were coded as Black, even though Black was not mentioned, as if we were the only ones who needed somehow to grow our own food. And I said, well, that's not an experience that everyone wants or has had a lot of success with, right? We had over, close to 1,000 Black farms at one point, all of which were decimated, unfunded, and so forth, taken away. So to have this sort of conversation absent that history, as if we have no knowledge as Black people about how to grow food, or that we have ever grown food in this country, was very short-sighted. And it was very judgmental, because the folks who often were making these suggestions and comments were not Black people. I would get folks who would come to me and say, how can we get people to stop eating at McDonald's? And my response is, why is that your concern? Right? Why is that your concern? What is your concern? Well, it's unhealthy. For whom? We can't assume that people aren't making various types of choices when they go to fast food establishments. And newsflash, the more money you make in this country, you also eat out quite a bit. You just don't eat out in the same places. You might be eating at Cava or Meza or someplace else, but we're not necessarily eating at home. So this notion that Black folks only don't eat in a slow food type of configuration is very untrue, and that's part of that misinformation that we started with. Does that mean that Black people only ever eat healthy? Absolutely not. Neither does anyone else. But for some reason, the surveillance of eating unhealthy tends to fall heavily on Black people's bodies. I was in a conversation earlier today with a graduate student for my material culture class about Black geographies. And something popped into my mind when I looked at an image that I pulled up earlier. It was about Black geographies as healing. And in it was a picture, which, I had said, oh, I don't need to share my screen, but I think I am going to share my screen because I think it's an important image to show, and it will really put a cap on this argument that I'm trying to make. Let me see here. Let me see if I can find it. Well, if I can't, then I won't worry about it. But the image was very interesting because it showed a very busy urban space. And one of the first signs I saw was a liquor store. But then I started thinking, you know what? If you remove every other Black business from that block, the only thing that remains is the liquor store. But in context, that liquor store is part of a number of Black establishments. There was a shoe shine, there was a gas station, there were eateries, there was a little small grocery store. So what's happening, right, on our landscapes? We look at Black communities and we're like, oh, they're full of blight. All they have are liquor stores and fast food. That's because everything else has been taken away through urban renewal, through closing down of businesses. And so what you have left are the things that people then want to blame Black communities for having after they have systematically taken them away. Everything from places where the children can play, to houses of worship, to small businesses. All of that is gone. And what is left are the things that you now are blaming Black people for having in their community, right? And that's the fast food and the liquor store. That's part of a systemic effort of inequality. That's what constitutes food apartheid. Because Black folks aren't making those choices. Those choices get made for us in terms of eminent domain, gentrification, redlining, you name it. So that's why I always say we have got to stop making food do all of this heavy lifting. Because when your focus is on the food, you can take it away from the systems that are in place in this country to keep Black and brown people in spaces of oppression, depression, oppression, suppression, and so forth. So we have to stop with that, again, level of misinformation and do the hard work that has to be done to understand why we see the communities that we see and the food choices being made the way that they do are made.
And I think this recognition of the data that we have, the way that we're measuring things, is one of sort of the limitations, or can be a limitation, when we're studying Black food culture or the dietary habits and behaviors of Black people. And so my next question is, what points of synergy do you see between the fields of nutrition, anthropology, food studies, in addressing inequities, and specifically the methodologies that you recommend using in Black American communities that can really enable sort of empowerment and dismantling of inequities?
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, so first of all, when I started writing Building Houses, I started from a methodology because the two are different, right? Methodology and method are different. I started from a methodology of Black liberation. As so many Black activists have said, but specifically more recently, whose birthday we just celebrated, Fannie Lou Hamer, until Black folks are free, none of us are free, quite frankly. So then I asked myself, how do I get at Black liberation? Who are the cultural transmitters in Black communities for cultural practices by and large? That's women. So I needed to know what the Black women were saying. So I already knew that I could not do a study that was secondary in nature, that I had to be able to hear what a variety of Black women were saying. And so that was part of my approach, right? And so there are a couple of different methods that I employed. First of all, I couldn't get around the stereotypical images in building houses out of chicken legs. I do have a number of images that I interrogate, right? Because they were so very central to building this narrative of Black people as deficit. I couldn't get around it. And so again, as I said earlier, I'm going to go back on what I said about sharing my screen, and I am going to share just a couple, because if you're not familiar with this work, and there's no reason necessarily that you would be, I want to just share a couple of those images, and I'm very aware. How much time do we have? How
So it's
much time?
almost the top of the hour, and we can
Okay,
give it
so
10 minutes
okay,
for
because
questions.
okay, all right. So I just will share a couple of. Can you all see these images?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, okay, perfect. So I just wanted to show, these are the images that we were, that circulated at the turn of the century, which was an important time because it was post-bellum. Black men had the right to vote. I do a whole read of these types of images in building houses, everything from sheet music to greeting cards to restaurant menus, right? All of which try to paint African American people as these caricatured images. So I was very clear that I had to debunk that, first of all. And then I also conducted focus groups. I looked at scholarly data. So I deployed an intersectional and interdisciplinary analysis because, first of all, that's part of my discipline. But more importantly, I don't understand how you can study Black people and not talk to people. I mean, they're going to tell you what they think, what they believe, what they see. And so surveys like you're doing, Salima, is important. But also hearing what Black people say. Social media is ripe for that because you'll get a lot of different responses. Sometimes you know who people, you know, the race of people. Sometimes you're not sure if you're talking to a bot. But overwhelmingly, if you look at enough of them, you tend to see some consistencies that emerge. And so, to my way of thinking, I do think you need to deploy a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to the study of Black life, because it's ever evolving, it's ever changing. It has evolved, it has changed. And Black people are as dynamic as any other race of people in this country, right? And so even as we normalize whiteness, we tend to be surrounded by a plethora of versions and visions of white life. But when it comes to Black life, we want to narrow that focus to a discipline. And I tend to argue and push back on that because I don't think it's a good way necessarily of understanding Black life, especially if it doesn't involve Black people telling you who they are, what they do, how they live, and how they thrive and survive in a country that is basically still very much racist, sexist, misogynist, and classist. I think you're on
Thanks
mute.
for that
Yeah,
response.
okay, all right.
Yes. And sharing a few of those images. I guess I expected to have more time, but I'll share another quilt for the audience this time. Audience, if you would, for the in-person members, for the in-person group in the auditorium, if somebody would come up to the mic and respond. So just responding to this image will take about a minute.
And Salima, just letting you know, we have until 12:15. So you have 15 more minutes.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
This like to me, the first thing that came to my mind was they look like pupils, eye pupils. Pupil.
Okay. Yeah, pupils, yes. Yes, thank you. So this quilt is called Middle Passage. So I'll leave it there, Middle Passage. Okay, so the next question I have is, so I guess I want to speak more about your career. And so are there moments that you can share with us where, because you have this understanding of Black liberation first and foremost, are there times where you've sacrificed comfort or made other sacrifices in striving for liberation and for justice? And then how do you see your work having evolved from when you started out to sort of the work that you do now?
Sacrifices. Yeah, I think anytime you speak truth that people don't want to hear, you run the risk of being ostracized or being ridiculed or what have you, sometimes from within your own community. And that's okay for me, you know. I grew up in a Black liberation household, and my dad's a minister. So, you know, I'm familiar with folks not agreeing. But I feel like we benefit more when we can maintain open dialogue. And I always try to, whether you agree or disagree, let's just have a conversation about it. Because, you know, none of us knows everything. And so what I'm sharing is my experience, my point of view, and points of view from people who I have talked with and worked with. And so I think that becomes very important for understanding, again, how we explain Black life. And just give me 1 second, because I just have to respond to my child who just wrote me. And that's another sacrifice. Whenever my child beeps in, that's my priority because, you know, because that's my life, right? And so sometimes in the academy in particular, you know, we shy away as women or as people of color from our lives. But I'm very clear in my life what my priorities are. And sometimes that might mean I don't get the prize, and that's okay for me. Because at the end of the day, we're all human, and I have bigger priorities than just my work in the academy. And so that has to be okay. So I have to, she's calling back again, so I have to just dash off for just 1 minute. I'm sorry, just 1 minute.
We'll do another quilt. Okay, so the next quilt, if the audience on Zoom would respond, if somebody can unmute and share what you see in this quilt, in this image, excuse me. And feel free to do so whenever, as early as now.
It's amazing to see this image, knowing the story of the Gee's Bend quilt makers, just because of the profundity of what they were doing with making them from the pieces and the stories they were embedding into them. And I don't know that I've seen the quilts and I've seen the exhibits in museums and things, but it's really profound to see perhaps one of the quilt makers right there engaging with the quilts. So this is very powerful. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Katrina. Yes, so this is an image of a resident of Gee's Bend, Alabama. So they get their name from the location. And as Dr. Williams-Forson referenced earlier, this was a source not only of cultural continuity, but also economic sort of salvation and being able to sell these quilts, make them, sell them. And they've been recognized since the civil rights movement onward as being sort of pillars in the Black American community, cultural community. So thanks, Katrina. I'm going to stop sharing now, and let's see, it's 1:06. I think I had a
Wait, but can I just say something? Can I say something very quickly to kind of bring all of this back around? The Gee's Bend is an important example of misinformation, and it's really important for folks, again, to do that work. Not only were the Gee's Benders cheated out of thousands of dollars from the sale of their quilt, and there was a lawsuit that ensued around that, but also there was this story that went out that all the quilts were used with messages to guide people during enslavement. And obviously that's not true because the quilts many of them were created much later. But so we have to always interrogate is, I guess, what I would say, going back to how we started and how we titled this program, because that information isn't always true.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. And I'm going to share my screen one last time, but we don't need to do sort of an exercise. I just wanted to share that this is called The Sunflowers Quilting Bees at Arles by Faith Ringgold, who actually recently passed away. She was a pivotal quilt maker in the community. And then we have sort of the food advocate, Fannie Lou Hamer, in the image. But it's open for questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams-Forson, for joining us today. And yeah, anybody want to start with the questions?
Great. Yeah, we're having in the room. I don't know if you can hear us, but you can see the applause. And so we'll take from questions from in the room and online. We have just a few minutes. So go ahead.
Hi, this is Naina. Thank you so much, Salima, for organizing. It's very refreshing to have such topics being discussed at Friedman. And so my question to Dr. Williams-Forson is, I'm interested to know about your views on the food marketing trends currently in the United States and the placement of Black people within the food marketing space.
By food, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by food marketing specifically?
Yes, sure. Yes, so like the way food ads are developed and the type of food products and who's used in these food ads.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, when an ad goes out, it's for everybody, right? Maybe what you're seeing also is more Black people being used in ads, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the ad is for Black people. So, you know, unless you're talking about, you know, Popeyes, for example, which tends to be marketed toward particular audiences, those in the South, those of color, because the belief is, again, that those are the folks who eat fried chicken, when we know that it's not just Black people who eat chicken, right? All people eat fried chicken. They just may not get it at Popeyes. So I don't really think anything about it. Honestly, this is age old. Again, this is why we need to do the historical work, because, you know, from time immemorial until today, Black folks have been associated with chicken. I wrote a whole book about it in Building Houses. And so, I think it's important for us, when we do see those types of ads, to interrogate, why is this happening?
Do we have any questions online?
I have a question if time allows.
Yes, we have 5 minutes.
Awesome. Dr. Williams-Forson, thank you for a really wonderful talk. I especially appreciated what I'm going to perceive as encouragement to challenge these static, simple stories and dominant discourses. And I know one of the themes of your work focuses on the labor and what I tend to think of as care work performed in food and food work, and the intersectionality of that work. And I'm curious to hear if you have other sort of themes that you think people who are seeking to challenge these dominant discourses should focus on when they talk about resilience within communities, whether that be food sharing, the care work of food production, procurement, and preparation, sort of topics of interest that you think can challenge these narratives.
Sure, thank you. I think it's also important that we stay open to what people eat, right? And not assume that, for example, any community, Black or otherwise, only eat a particular subset of foods, right? So, of course, we know you do have Black vegans, you do have Black vegetarians, and you have always had this since the time that we arrived on these shores. So, to make assumptions about that, you should also assume that Black people do exercise, do different types of exercise, from yoga to Pilates to running to walking. So I think staying open as opposed to foreclosing on multiple types of possibilities is a good place to start. At the same time, recognizing that everybody's food culture is valuable is also an important place to start, right? Instead of demonizing and pitting one food culture against another, the Mediterranean is better than the soul food, which soul food in and of itself is an entirely different conversation, because that's a cultural construction, that's an expressive culture designation that is not necessarily, even though he used food to describe it, he also used music, dance, clothing are also soul, right? And to recognize that the soul, all of those foods that are characterized as soul food are also Southern foods, right? They tend to be eaten by people in the lower South and in the mid South for their taste, for the ways of preparing, for all of that. So remaining open as opposed to going in with the biases that we as academics often go in with would help us to get better understanding of various cultures that we engage.
Thank you.
Great. Well, could I ask one last question? If we have a 1-minute answer, could you just tell us a bit more about how you get information out of archives? Where are you looking? What are you reading? I think you mentioned this a few times, and I think it would be nice to unpack that a little bit so we can really learn from that.
Sure. I mean, everything to me is an archive. Everything is an archive. And I don't shy away from any source. I use popular culture, virtual media, the actual physical documented archive in the National Archives, Library of Congress. I especially utilize Library of Congress because a lot of their images are online. But there are tons of folks nowadays who have put their archive online. I think we have to be careful about deciding what is and what is not an archive. It's not just the written record, right? It's performance. It's all kinds of activity. I use plays. I use written plays, the visual performance of plays. Archaeology. I just gave a talk last Saturday at a historic house, and so I'm using the archaeological record to get at some of this information. I use social media. Issues that come up and so forth. And I think that the richness of what we have to provide to the world as intellectuals, as academics, as public intellectuals, really does derive from the world around us, right? Conversations, all of that can become fodder if placed in particular context and then shared with those with whom you're in conversation. All of it to me is academic, right? Because for me, academics is about learning, it's about sharing knowledge, it's about receiving understanding. And so for me, nothing is off limits in terms of engaging the world, and specifically this work that I do in the study of Black life and culture, and even more specific, in the study of food.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Salima, for running this. And thank you, Dr. Williams-Forson, for joining us. We were so delighted to have you both here with us today. And so maybe you could do one more round of applause in the room and say thank you so much. We'll see
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see everyone next week. We have 2 people coming who will be in person. And so we look forward to another dynamic discussion next week. Thank you all for being here.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.